My name is Nathaniel Osborne. I am 70 years old, and I live in Shaker Heights on the east side of Cleveland, Ohio. I never told my daughter what I really kept inside Warehouse 12, and when she married a slick, fast-talking gold digger who thought he could outsmart a tired old man in a flannel shirt, I made absolutely certain he would never find the key. But on a rain-hammered night last October, while I sat at home nursing a glass of bourbon, my warehouse manager called me in a dead panic. "Sir, your son-in-law is at the gate. He has bolt cutters, and he brought 2 armed men." I did not panic. I had been waiting for that exact moment for weeks, and what I did next brought his entire counterfeit world crashing down around his ears. If this story pulls you in the way it still pulls at me, do me one small kindness. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the life stories I have left to tell. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is there right now. An old man takes real comfort in knowing which corner of the country or the planet is sitting with him tonight. It was exactly 11:30 at night when the phone rang. The rain was coming down in hard, slanting sheets, drumming against the thick glass windows of my house like 1,000 impatient fingers. I had built that house with money earned, one busted knuckle at a time, and on nights like that one, I could feel every year of the work in my shoulders. People look at me now and see a quiet, retired widower. They see a man who prunes his roses, drinks his evening bourbon, and waves at the neighbors from the porch. They do not see the man who survived 30 years in the cutthroat steel and salvage business on the shores of Lake Erie. They do not see the man who built an industrial salvage empire out of rust, sweat, and scrap metal that other men were too proud to touch. That is fine by me. A lifetime in the yards teaches you that the most dangerous machines are the quiet ones. I had just poured myself a generous measure of bourbon, the good bottle I save for occasions, when my burner phone buzzed against the mahogany desk. Very few people alive have that number. One of them is Walter Briggs, a 65-year-old Army veteran who has managed my industrial properties with absolute loyalty for 2 decades. Walter is not a man who rattles. He once talked down a crane operator having a heart attack 40 feet in the air without raising his voice. So when I picked up and heard the tight, rasping whisper on the other end, my spine went straight. "Mr. Osborne, it is happening. Preston is at gate 4. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my drink, feeling the familiar burn slide down my throat. "Is he alone, Walter?" "No, sir. He has bolt cutters and he brought company. 2 big men. They are armed. I can see the glint of handguns tucked in their waistbands. What are your orders?" Do I engage? Do I trip the silent alarms? I stood up from my leather chair and picked up my tablet, my fingers tapping through to the hidden high-definition surveillance feed I had quietly installed weeks earlier. The screen flared to life, cutting through the darkness with crisp night vision, and there he was. My son-in-law, Preston Vance, the self-proclaimed venture capitalist. The man who wore suits that cost more than my first truck, standing in the freezing mud of an industrial district at midnight, gripping a pair of heavy iron bolt cutters. The rain had plastered his perfectly styled hair flat against his forehead. Even through a camera lens, I could see the desperate, greedy twitch working in his jaw. "No, Walter," I said, and my voice came out dead calm. "Do not engage. Do not call the police. Pull every perimeter guard back. Open up the outer blind spots. Give him a clean, easy path to the main loading dock." Walter hesitated for a fraction of a second. He had known me too long to question my sanity out loud. "Are you absolutely sure, sir? Those men with him look like serious trouble." "I am entirely sure," I said, and I rested my free hand on the framed photograph of my late wife Eleanor that sits on my desk where the light hits it in the morning. "Let him cut the lock, Walter. Let him walk right in. Tonight that boy digs his own grave, and I intend to watch him jump into it." I hung up and set the phone down. On the screen, Preston was wrestling with the heavy chain on the outer fence, slipping in the mud, cursing at the rain. He looked pathetic, a rat gnawing its way into a steel trap. He had no earthly idea what was actually waiting for him behind those rusted, dilapidated doors. He believed he was one snapped padlock away from financial salvation. He believed he had finally outsmarted a clueless old man. As I watched him break through that first lock, a cold, hard knot of anger tightened in my chest, and my mind went back. Because to understand how my daughter's husband ended up committing a felony in the dead of night on my property, you have to go back exactly 3 months. You have to go back to the moment the first seed of doubt was planted. The moment I realized a parasite had attached itself to my family. It was Camille and Preston's second wedding anniversary. Camille is my 32-year-old daughter, the light of what remains of my life. She is a sweet, trusting soul who runs her own boutique floral design shop in the Tremont neighborhood, a little storefront that always smells of eucalyptus, damp potting soil, and fresh lilies. When Eleanor passed, I stood at her graveside and made a silent vow. I would protect our girl from everything. From heartbreak, from failure, and above all from greedy men who prey on kindness the way rust preys on steel. Camille had organized an anniversary dinner at a high-end steakhouse downtown, one of those places with valet parking and menus without prices. I arrived early in a simple clean suit, happy just to watch my daughter smile. Preston arrived 15 minutes late, loudly berating the valet, flashing a watch that cost more than most people's cars, and moving through the dining room like he held the deed to the building. He had always rubbed me wrong. He talked too fast, he promised too much, and his eyes were never on the person in front of him. They were always sweeping the room, hunting for someone more important. We were halfway through our ribeyes when the conversation took a turn I will never forget. Camille was talking about a new flower supplier she had found down in Columbus, but Preston was somewhere else entirely. He kept tapping his fork against his water glass, his eyes flicking toward me between sentences. Then he leaned back in his chair, swirled his wine, and dropped it into the middle of the table like it was nothing at all. "So, Nathaniel," he said, "I was driving through the industrial flats the other day, scouting commercial real estate for a tech startup I am funding. I happened to pass one of your old properties. Warehouse 12, I believe it is called." I stopped chewing. I set my fork down very slowly. Outwardly, I gave him nothing. Inwardly, every alarm bell I own began to ring at once. I have never discussed my business holdings with Preston. Not once. I have never mentioned Warehouse 12 to anyone, not even to Camille. It is an old, rusted facility sitting at the dead end of a neglected service road by the river. There is no reason on God's green earth for a venture capitalist to be driving through that particular stretch of broken pavement, let alone pulling county property records, to learn that it traces back to me. "Is that so?" I said, keeping my expression neutral and faintly puzzled. "Just an old holding property. Nothing in it but dust and rusted pipe." "Why do you ask?" Preston smiled. It was a slick, rehearsed smile that never made it anywhere near his eyes. "Just curious. Seems like prime land if you cleared the junk out. Big footprint. You know, holding dead weight like that is bad business, Nathaniel. Taxes, liabilities. Have you ever thought about liquidating? I know developers who would pay top dollar for the dirt alone." I looked at my daughter. Camille was sipping her champagne, blissfully unaware of the tension coiling under the tablecloth, smiling at her husband like he had hung the moon. She thought he was being helpful. She thought he was exactly the wealthy, successful investor he claimed to be. But my gut, an instrument tuned by 4 decades of scrap thieves, crooked contractors, and smiling men with empty pockets, was telling me something very different. Why would a man who supposedly manages tens of millions in venture capital care about an abandoned warehouse in the Rust Belt? Why was he digging through my private holdings? And why, underneath all that tailoring, did his eyes look so desperately hungry? I wiped my mouth with my napkin and let a slow, harmless, grandfatherly smile spread across my face. The kind of smile that convinces a predator his prey is blind. "Well, Preston," I said, keeping my voice light and a little raspy, "I am just a retired old man. Real estate markets and developer portfolios are a bit past me these days." I let the place sit. "It is not hurting anybody." I saw it then, a brief, sharp flash of satisfaction crossing his face like heat lightning. He thought I was weak. He thought I was senile. He thought he had just discovered a gold mine guarded by a scarecrow. But as I sat there matching his counterfeit smile with one of my own, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My daughter was married to a fraud. I did not yet know his angle or how deep the rot went. But I was going to find out, and I was going to tear his facade apart, rivet by rivet, until the ugly truth stood naked in front of Camille, where she could not look away from it. I paid the bill that night without blinking. When the waiter brought the leather folder, Preston did not so much as gesture toward his wallet. He leaned back, patted his stomach, and complimented the Wagyu. I handed over my card with a warm smile, playing the generous, satisfied father to perfection. But under the table, my hands were clenched into fists, and my knuckles, permanently scarred from decades of pulling jagged steel apart, throbbed with an old familiar ache. The drive home was quiet. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets of Cleveland slick and glowing amber under the streetlights. Rolling through the city in my old truck, my mind drifted back to the beginning. It is funny how men like Preston look at me now. They see an old man in a flannel shirt and assume my life was as simple as my wardrobe. They have no idea what it costs to build a salvage empire from absolute zero. When Eleanor and I married, we owned a rusted pickup and a mountain of debt, and not one thing more. I worked 14-hour days in the yards. I breathed burning copper and diesel and damp earth until it settled into my pores. I tore apart condemned factories, stripped wire out of dead mills along the Cuyahoga, and hauled scrap iron until my back felt like it was splitting down the middle. I did it all for them. Eleanor would come down to the yard at 7 in the evening, carrying a thermos of black coffee and 2 sandwiches wrapped in foil. We would sit on the tailgate of that old truck, filthy and bone-tired, and talk about the future we were building for Camel. On her deathbed, I promised Eleanor that no one would ever take what we built for our little girl. I intended to keep that promise if it was the last thing my body allowed me to do. Men like Preston Vance despise the dirt. They recoil from the smell of sweat and grease. Yet they are always first in line, manicured hands extended, to claim the money the dirt produced. He thought I was an old fool hoarding useless industrial lots. He did not understand that in my line of work, you learn one slough skill above all others. You learn to spot worthless scrap dressed up as something shiny. I barely slept that night. I sat in my study, the one room in the house that still smells faintly of the old salvage days, and stared at the dark oak walls, turning one question over and over. Why that specific warehouse? The holding company that owns it is buried under layers of legal insulation. A man would have to be actively hunting through my assets to trace that property back to my name. The answer came knocking the very next morning, at 8 o'clock sharp on a Sunday. I was in the kitchen brewing dark roast when the doorbell chimed. Through the peephole, I saw Camille and Preston on the porch. He looked like he had stepped out of the pages of a finance magazine, crisp navy suit, leather portfolio clutched to his chest like scripture. Camille stood beside him holding a cardboard tray of coffees, tired around the eyes, wearing a smile that looked like work. I unlocked the door and pasted pleasant surprise across my face. Camille, sweetheart, what a treat. You should have called. I would have put breakfast together. We brought pastries, Dad, she said, kissing my cheek on her way to the kitchen. I know it is early, but Preston was up half the night working on something for you. He was so excited he could not wait until Monday. Good morning, Nathaniel, Preston said, extending his hand, radiating a false, energetic warmth. Sorry for the ambush, but when opportunity strikes, you have to grab it. I shook his soft, manicured hand, feeling the contrast against my calloused palm, and led him to the living room. He sat, laid the portfolio on the coffee table with a heavy thud, and unzipped it with practiced efficiency, spreading a stack of glossy, professionally bound documents across the glass. Nathaniel, I know we only touched on this at dinner, he began, leaning forward on his elbows to appear earnest. But I could not stop thinking about your holdings. I did a deep dive into the county records. I hope you do not mind. I only want to look out for this family's future. I picked up the first folder. The cover page was an aerial map of the industrial district, with Warehouse 12 outlined in red ink, flanked by a breakdown of estimated property taxes, maintenance liabilities, and projected annual losses. He had done homework. I will grant him that. But every number on those pages was built from public tax records. He had no idea what actually went on behind those rusted doors. You are bleeding money on a dead asset, Nathaniel, he pressed on, his voice sliding into a register of deep artificial concern. That warehouse sits on prime commercial land, but the structure is a liability. You are paying commercial taxes on an empty shell. As a venture capitalist, it physically hurts me to watch capital rot like that. You are 70 years old. You should be traveling, relaxing, not paying taxes on rusted metal and contaminated soil. I have developed my private network right now, he said, and his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that crossed the line into predatory. They want industrial footprints in that exact zip code. I can broker a private sale, get that dead weight off your hands by the end of the month, and drop a massive liquid cash injection straight into your retirement account. You will not lift a finger. I handle the paperwork, the lawyers, the negotiations, everything. Camille came in with the coffees and pastries and settled beside him, wrapping her arm through his, and looked at me with an expression that made my stomach turn. Dad, you have to admit he is making sense, she said softly, though there was an edge under the softness. You have worked so hard your whole life. You do not need the stress of abandoned properties. You are not a young man anymore. Preston is a financial genius. This is what he does. Let him help you. Then came the sting I did not expect. You need to let go of the past, Dad, she went on, her tone tipping into something patronizing. Those scrapyards, those dirty old warehouses, they belong to a different lifetime. You promised Mom you would take care of yourself. Let Preston handle it. It is what he does best. The rage flared hot and sharp behind my sternum. My sweet, trusting daughter was sitting in my living room, unknowingly helping a parasite drain her own inheritance. He had turned her. He had convinced her he was the family's financial savior, a brilliant benefactor stooping down to rescue us. I wanted to take him by the collar of that tailored suit and put him out on the sidewalk. I wanted to demand a full accounting of exactly how much debt he was hiding behind those beautiful clothes. Instead, I let my shoulders drop. I released a long, weary sigh and became exactly the tired, confused old man he needed me to be. Well, Preston, this is an awful lot to take in, I said, tapping a calloused finger against his glossy report. I am not used to moving this fast. My accountant handles the tax forms, and all this modern financial jargon runs a little past me. Triumph flashed across his face. You do not need to understand the jargon, Nathaniel. That is what I am here for. I can draw up limited proxy documents this afternoon, just a signature, so I can negotiate with the buyers on your behalf. I shook my head slowly and gathered the folders into a neat stack. I appreciate the hard work, son. I truly do, but I am old-fashioned. I never sign anything the same day I read it. Leave the proposal. I will go through it this week with a magnifying glass and a cup of tea, and we will talk again. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The jaw tightened. Impatience leaked through the seams, just long enough for me to catch it. He needed money, and he needed it fast. Of course, Nathaniel, he recovered, packing the documents away. Take your time. Just remember, markets move. These buyers will not wait forever. As I walked them to the door, Preston paused at the entrance to my private study. His eyes slid past the open door and landed squarely on the heavy vintage steel safe bolted into the corner of the room. He looked at it for 2 seconds. 2 seconds was all I needed. He was not going to wait politely for my signature. He was already scouting another way in. The hunt had officially begun, and God help him, I was ready to play. I spent that Sunday preparing the battlefield. I went online and ordered 3 high-definition, motion-activated hidden cameras, models built to look like ordinary household objects. A digital clock, a smoke detector, a charging brick. I paid for expedited shipping and planned the sightlines in my head while the confirmation emails rolled in, every angle of the study covered, with the vintage safe squarely in frame. Then I turned to the safe itself. It held important documents, family heirlooms, and a meaningful amount of emergency cash, and I was not about to leave any of it within his reach. I emptied everything into a heavy duffel to move to a bank vault first thing Monday. In their place, I left a few bundles of single-dollar bills dressed with hundreds on the outside, an old decoy trick from my rough early days in the yards. And I left one very particular document, a fabricated inventory sheet, printed on official-looking company letterhead, describing a fictional stockpile of unregistered industrial platinum, supposedly housed at Warehouse 12. Estimated value $15 million. A quiet liquidation sale pending. It was bait built in a laboratory for one specific animal, a desperate man praying for a massive, untraceable payday. If Preston ever cracked that safe, he would not find my life savings. He would find a one-way ticket to a federal courtroom. I swung the heavy steel door shut and spun the dial. The metallic click echoed through the quiet room with a satisfying finality. The board was set. Preston believed he was the mastermind, the brilliant venture capitalist running circles around a relic. He was about to learn what every green kid on my cruise learned the hard way. You do not walk into a scrapyard unless you are prepared to be crushed by the machinery. Then I let him marinate. 2 full weeks, not one update. I ignored his casual texts, dodged his friendly calls, and maintained the flawless illusion of an old man dragging his feet. I needed the pressure on his end to build until it cracked that polished exterior wide open. The crack appeared on a crisp Tuesday morning, right in front of my daughter's flower shop. Camille owns a beautiful little boutique in Tremont. She poured her heart, her soul, and every dollar of her savings into that place. I decided to surprise her with her favorite cinnamon scones from the bakery down the block. I parked my truck a street over and walked toward her storefront, enjoying the cold morning air off the lake. But as I rounded the corner, the picture postcard scene of her shop was shattered by the grinding roar of heavy diesel machinery. A massive, battered tow truck was backed aggressively into the loading zone behind Camille's shop. The hydraulic lift was already engaged, whining as it hoisted the front tires of her custom-painted floral delivery van off the pavement. I quickened my pace, my heart giving one hard thump. Through the shop's glass I saw her on the sidewalk, cardigan wrapped tight around herself, shoulders shaking. She was crying. A burly man in a high-visibility vest stood beside the truck with a clipboard, thoroughly unmoved by her tears. I dropped the bakery box on a wrought iron bench and got to her fast, wrapping an arm around her trembling shoulders. "Camille, sweetheart, what is going on here, Dad? I do not understand," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "He says he is repossessing the van. He says we missed 3 straight lease payments, but that is impossible. Preston handles all the business accounts. He set up the auto pay months ago. There has to be some horrible mistake." I turned to the man with the clipboard. He had the tired, cynical look of someone who deals in other people's worst days. "Excuse me, friend," I said, level but firm. "I think there may be a clerical error here. My daughter owns this business. We can clear this up right now." The repo man did not blink. "Look, buddy, I just get the work orders. Leasing company issued the recovery yesterday. 3 months delinquent. No response to the warning letters. Grace period is over. I am here to collect the asset. You want to argue numbers, call the bank." I was reaching into my breast pocket for my checkbook, fully prepared to write a check on the hood of his truck to stop my daughter's tears, when tires screeched down the street. Preston's leased sports car swerved into the loading zone, jumped the curb, and slammed to a stop. He threw the door open and sprinted toward us. And I want you to understand, he did not look like the confident venture capitalist who had lounged on my sofa 2 weeks earlier. He looked like a man running for his life. His immaculate hair was plastered to his forehead with cold sweat. His tie hung loose, his collar was open, and his eyes were wild. "Hey, stop right there. Drop that vehicle immediately," he shouted, waving his arms at the repo man. "What do you think you are doing? This is a banking error. You are stealing private property." The driver crossed his arms. "Save the performance, pal. The account is empty. The payments bounced. I am hooking the rear axle and pulling out of here in 2 minutes." Preston yanked a sleek phone from his pocket, hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it on the concrete, and stabbed at the screen. "Listen to me very closely," he growled into it, pacing a tight, agitated circle. "My wealth management firm handles millions in liquid assets. My private bank flagged the autodraft as fraud because of a security update. It is a protective hold on the commercial account. That is all. I am transferring funds from my personal portfolio right now." I watched him closely, my concerned father mask hiding the cold, methodical observation happening behind my eyes. I watched a heavy bead of sweat trace down his neck in 40-degree air. I watched the erratic tremor in his hands. I watched his expensive leather shoes shifting restlessly on the pavement like the ground was hot. Camille stepped toward him and touched his arm. "Preston, what is happening? Why would the bank freeze the account for 3 months without telling us?" He flinched from her touch. It lasted a fraction of a second, but I caught it, the reflex of a cornered animal. "Do not worry about it, Camille," he snapped, far sharper than the gentle voice he kept for her. "I told you, it is a technical glitch. The wires got crossed between the offshore holding and the domestic branch. I am fixing it. Just let me work." He spent 10 minutes arguing with someone on that phone, hushed and frantic, making wild, pleading gestures down the alleyway. Finally, he marched back and shoved the phone into the repo driver's face. The driver listened, sighed heavily, and handed it back. "Fine," he muttered, looking at Preston with open disgust. "The agency confirmed a manual wire. You bought yourself 30 days, buddy. If that wire bounces, I am coming straight to your driveway." The hydraulic lift lowered Camille's van with a long hiss, and the tow truck rattled away, trailing diesel exhaust. Camille sagged against the van, rubbing her temples. My God, she whispered. That was terrifying. Preston, are you sure everything is okay with the business account? He forced a laugh, ran a trembling hand through his ruined hair, and pulled her into a hug, kissing the top of her head. Everything is perfectly fine, babe, I promise. A stupid clerical error. You know how these giant banks operate. An algorithm flags a transfer, and everything freezes. I will have my assistant chew out our account manager this afternoon. She smiled and leaned into his chest, fully comforted. But as Preston looked at me over her shoulder, his eyes met mine, and for one unguarded second, the mask slipped completely off. I was not looking at a wealthy investor. I was looking at pure, undiluted terror. Then the arrogant smile snapped back into place and he clapped his hands. Well, crisis averted, he announced, an octave too high. Nathaniel, good to see you. Sorry for the morning drama. Just the trials of high-level corporate banking, right? Right, I said smoothly, retrieving the bakery box and pressing it into Camille's hands. High-level corporate banking. I hugged my daughter, kissed her cheek, and walked back to my truck. I did not start the engine. I sat gripping the wheel, staring at my own reflection in the mirror, and let the arithmetic finish itself. Millionaire venture capitalists do not get their wives' delivery vans repossessed over a glitch. Men managing vast liquid portfolios do not shake like addicts while wiring a few $100s to a collections agency. They do not look at a tow truck driver with life-or-death terror in their eyes. Preston Vance was not experiencing a banking error. Preston Vance was drowning. He was suffocating under a mountain of hidden debt, and he was bleeding my daughter's business dry to plug the holes in his sinking ship. My gut suspicion had hardened into fact. My son-in-law was a desperate, dangerous fraud, and he needed a massive infusion of cash to save his own skin. Which explained, with perfect clarity, his sudden burning interest in my warehouse. He was hunting for a lifeline. I decided, right there behind the wheel, to hand him an anvil. That Friday afternoon, the doorbell rang. Camille stood on my porch with an overnight bag, looking exhausted. Preston stood behind her, gripping a duffel and wearing a strained smile. A plumbing failure, they explained. The master bathroom had flooded and ruined the carpets in their townhouse, and the property management company needed the weekend to run industrial dehumidifiers. It sounded plausible. I knew better. Millionaires do not flee to a father-in-law's guest room over a burst pipe. They check into a hotel downtown and let the insurance company foot the bill. I smiled warmly and stepped aside, offering the guest suite. I knew exactly why they had come. The plumbing story was a costume. Preston was out of time, his creditors were circling, and he needed unrestricted access to my home. Letting him sleep under my roof felt like tucking a copperhead into my bed. But I played the gracious host. I cooked dinner, I poured his scotch. I listened to him boast about phantom portfolios, while Camille leaned on his shoulder, blind to the desperation radiating off him like heat off summer asphalt. By 10, they excused themselves to bed. I waited for the heavy oak door of the guest suite to click shut, then retreated to my room, leaving my own door open a crack. I did not sleep. I lay on top of the covers in the dark, fully clothed, listening to the house I have lived in for 3 decades. When you spend a lifetime guarding scrapyards full of valuable copper, you become a famously light sleeper. You learn the difference between a foundation settling and a human foot trying to be quiet. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed midnight, then 1. The neighborhood was dead to the world. And at exactly 14 minutes past 2 in the morning I heard it, the soft, muffled groan of wood. The 4th floorboard in the upstairs hallway, just outside the guest suite, has a distinct complaint when you step on its center. I swung my legs off the mattress and stood bare feet silent on the carpet. No lights. I moved through the shadows of my own home, with the practiced ease of a man who knows every angle of his territory. Down the stairs, breathing slow, and stopped at the bottom with my back against the cool plaster. Someone was in my private study. The heavy mahogany door stood open a fraction of an inch, a thin blade of pale light slicing through the gap and trembling across the hallway floor. I edged closer and looked through the crack. Preston was inside, dressed in dark white sweatpants and a black shirt, a small penlight clamped between his teeth. He was kneeling in front of my fireproof filing cabinet, the one that sits directly beneath Eleanor's framed photograph, working a thin tension wrench and a lockpick into the simple cylinder lock. He had bypassed the big steel safe in the corner. Evidently, on his scouting trip through my doorway, He had concluded he lacked the tools for a mechanical combination dial. So he had gone for the softer target. I watched him work. His breathing was ragged, loud in the still room. His hands shook with an unhinged urgency that told me everything. This was no professional. This was a desperate man backed into a corner, with the last of his morals burned off for fuel. The lock surrendered with a soft metallic click. He tore the bottom drawer open and began ripping through the hanging folders, tossing aside utility bills, property deeds, old tax returns. He was hunting for something specific, liquid numbers. He wanted to know exactly what I was worth, and exactly how fast he could get his hands on it. I let him dig for a full minute, absorbing the sheer scale of the betrayal. He was standing in a house my sweat had paid for, trying to steal the future I had built for the woman sleeping upstairs. Then I stepped into the doorway, raised my hand, and flipped the brass light switch. The study flooded with harsh yellow light. Preston gasped, a sharp, terrified sound, and physically recoiled, dropping the penlight onto the carpet as he spun around, eyes enormous, chest heaving. He looked like a deer staring down an oncoming freight train. "Preston," I said, keeping my voice mild and groggy, as though I had just shuffled out of a deep sleep. "What on earth are you doing down here in the dark? Is something wrong with the guest room?" For 3 agonizing seconds he simply stared, his mind visibly scrambling for a lie. Then the con artist took the wheel. He let out a breathless chuckle, raked a hand through his hair, and leaned casually against the filing cabinet, positioning his legs to block my view of the open drawer. "Nathaniel," he exhaled, pressing a palm to his heart in exaggerated relief. "You scared the living daylights out of me. I am so sorry for creeping around. I woke up with brutal heartburn. That brisket really did a number on me. I did not want to wake Camille, so I came down hunting for the kitchen, got turned around in the dark, and wandered into your office. I was just feeling for a light switch." I gave him a gentle, accommodating smile while disgust boiled quietly in my veins. "Of course, son," I said, my tone dripping warm sympathy. "The kitchen is down the hall to the left. I keep antacids in the pantry above the sink. Let me grab them for you." I fetched the chalky tablets and pressed them into his hand. He thanked me profusely and hurried upstairs. I waited until his footsteps faded, then walked back into the study. He had closed the drawer, but in his panic he had been careless. I pulled it open. The folder detailing my total net worth and liquid reserves was yanked halfway up, jutting crookedly from my otherwise meticulous files. He had found precisely what he came looking for. The next morning I stood in the kitchen flipping through the newspaper, while Camille came down rubbing sleep from her eyes and kissed my cheek. Preston followed, looking remarkably refreshed for a man who had spent the small hours picking a lock. He greeted me with hollow enthusiasm, poured his cereal, chatted about the weather. I played the gracious host and asked after his heartburn. "Much better," he assured me, entirely oblivious to what I knew. By then, the hidden cameras were already in place. I had installed them earlier that week, while the two of them ran errands: the digital clock on the living room mantel, the smoke detector and charging brick in the study. Every lens positioned with a scrapman's eye for angles, because a displaced file folder proves nothing. If I went to Camille with a crooked folder, Preston would spin a dozen silky lies before lunch. I needed him caught in the act, in high definition beyond the reach of any explanation. After breakfast, Camille mentioned she needed a shower before a client meeting. Preston announced he would read in the living room. It was the perfect window. I told them cheerfully that I was heading out for my morning walk. On my way through the living room, I took my tablet from my briefcase, unlocked the screen, and disabled the auto lock. I opened my email to a message I had carefully fabricated the night before, dressed up as confidential correspondence from my wealth management bank. The subject line read, "Urgent, portfolio liquidation." The body described an impending transfer of $7 million into a highly liquid checking account. For a drowning man, it was a life raft made of gold. I set the glowing tablet gently on the center of the coffee table, an arm's length from Preston, grabbed my walking stick, called out a cheerful goodbye, and pulled the front door shut behind me with a loud, definitive click. I did not go for a walk. I went 2 blocks down, slid into my truck, and opened the secure application linked to my hidden cameras. The live feed buffered, then snapped into crystal clarity, and I settled in to watch the silent movie playing in my own living room. For 2 full minutes, Preston did nothing. He sat with a magazine open, staring at nothing, listening. waiting to be sure Camille was in the shower and I was truly gone. The faint hiss of running water upstairs gave him his all clear. The magazine came down. His head snapped toward the coffee table, and his eyes locked onto the glowing screen like it was a brick of gold bullion. The internal debate lasted seconds. The pull of that fabricated email was a force of nature he had no equipment to resist. He threw one paranoid glance over his shoulder at the staircase, then reached out and snatched the tablet off the glass. The camera caught his face with agonizing clarity. The polished mask of the successful investor dissolved, and underneath it was the feral, hungry face of a scavenger. His eyes raced across the fake email. His jaw dropped. $7 million liquid ready to move. The exact lifeline he had been praying for. He did not just read it. He pulled out his own phone, hands shaking so badly, he had to brace his elbows on his knees to steady the camera, and photographed the screen, the fake account numbers, the routing details, the contact line for a bank manager who did not exist. Then, greed fully in the driver's seat, he began swiping through my private device, my banking apps, my files, hunting through my life like a burglar with a flashlight. I watched it all from the cab of my truck with a cold, settled disgust. Then I drove home, retrieved my tablet from the exact spot on the table where he had carefully replaced it, and complimented him on how relaxing the morning seemed. 2 days later, I raised the stakes. Camille called me in tears from the boutique. The commercial account was frozen, she said. Vendor payments bouncing, payroll at risk, and Preston storming around blaming the incompetent banking system. That evening they returned to my house looking wrung out, Camille's eyes red, Preston wearing a mask of righteous fury about institutions holding their funds hostage. I made dinner, I offered encouraging words, and I watched him perform. He was a spectacular liar, kissing my daughter's forehead, promising everything would resolve by Monday, while under the glass table his right knee bounced with a wild, uncontrollable tremor. The debt was eating him alive from the inside. He was running out of lies, out of money, and out of time. He needed a miracle, so I gave him one. That afternoon, while they were out, I had prepared the study for its final act. Into the filing cabinet drawer, the same drawer he had already picked once, I placed the fabricated inventory manifest, the $15 million in fictional unregistered platinum, sitting in warehouse 12, with a red confidential stamp left just slightly exposed to catch the light. I did not want him fumbling with tension wrenches again. I wanted him to slide that drawer open and find his salvation with agonizing ease. I verified every camera angle, the smoke detector covering the cabinet, the clock covering the doorway, the feed on my phone pristine. Then I left the study door open exactly an inch and a half, a sliver of darkness. A whispered invitation to a man whose greed had become an addiction. At 10:30, they excused themselves to the guest suite. I lay on my bed fully clothed, phone in hand, screen dark, camera app primed. I did not have to wait until 2 this time. Desperation accelerates. At the stroke of midnight, the 4th floorboard groaned. Soft footsteps descended the staircase. I raised my phone and tapped the live feed. The study door swung silently open, casting a long shadow across the carpet, and Preston Vance stepped into the room, swallowed the bait whole, and sealed his own fate. The morning after, the air in my house was thick with unspoken tension. At breakfast, Preston vibrated with a manic, badly concealed energy, drinking his coffee too fast, eyes darting, unable to sit still. He announced that the property managers had finally cleared the plumbing issue, and they needed to get home. Camille looked relieved, entirely unaware that her husband was actually racing off to organize a phantom heist. I carried their bags to the driveway, playing the wistful father saying goodbye to his girl. I hugged Camille tight, chin resting on her hair, breathing in her floral perfume, and promised to visit the boutique that week. Then I turned to Preston, shook his hand, and wished him luck with his meetings. And as I handed him his heavy leather briefcase, my thumb brushed the seam of the side pocket, where, earlier that morning, while he showered off the sweat of his midnight burglary, I had slipped a tiny listening device deep into the lining. Barely the size of a coin, long-life battery, cellular transmitter. I watched his leased sports car disappear down the street. Then I walked straight to my truck, locked the doors, and opened the secure audio application. The interface hummed to life, linking to the transmitter riding in the seam of his briefcase. For 20 minutes I heard highway noise and soft radio. Then a passenger door opened and closed. He had dropped Camille at the flower shop. The moment she was out of the car, the entire soundscape changed. The radio snapped off. I could hear him breathing, heavy, ragged, frantic, the sound of a man running out of oxygen. Tires squealed. Minutes later, the car lurched to a stop and the transmission ground into park. I closed my eyes, leaned my head back against the headrest, and listened. The rapid, erratic tapping of a phone keypad. 3 rings, then a voice low and gravelly, stripped of all warmth, saying a single word. His name. Preston exhaled a shaking breath and his voice came out pitched high with pure desperation. Listen to me. I know the payment is late. I know we are past the grace period. But you have to hear me right now. I just found the ultimate score. The solution to everything. It is bigger than anything we ever discussed. The gravel voice cut through his panic like a dull blade. We are not interested in your empty promises, Vance. We gave you 2 weeks to liquidate the wife's business assets. You missed the deadline. The boss is out of patience. You owe $2 million. You have 48 hours to deliver the cash, or we send a crew to your house to collect payment in flesh. No, you do not understand, Preston shouted, his voice ringing inside the car. I am not talking about the flower shop. That place is drained. There is nothing left to squeeze. I am talking about $15 million in unregistered, untraceable industrial platinum. The line went dead silent. Even through an audio feed, I could feel the atmosphere shift, the way the air changes before a storm hits the lake. Explain, the loan shark commanded, suddenly sharp and attentive. Preston swallowed hard, breath shuddering into the microphone. My father-in-law, he is an old scrap metal hoarder, owns a dozen industrial properties around the city. I thought he was a clueless old man sitting on worthless real estate, but I got into his private study last night. I found his confidential holding manifests. He has been stockpiling decommissioned aerospace components and catalytic converters off the books for a decade. He has a massive cache of pure platinum and rhodium sitting in a secure facility outside the city limits. Warehouse 12. I saw the paperwork with my own eyes. It is completely off the grid. The government does not even know it exists. You are telling me this old man is sitting on $15 million in raw metal, and you can get to it, the loan shark said, a predatory edge creeping in. I can get you full access, Preston insisted, words tripping over each other in his rush to save his own hide. He is old and trusting. He is practically begging me to manage his assets. Give me 3 days. 72 hours. I will get the keys, the coordinates, the security codes, the layout. You send your crew with transport trucks and take the whole stockpile. We fence the metal. You take your $2 million, an extra $1 million for the trouble, and I keep the rest. It is a clean, untraceable ghost job. There was another long, suffocating pause. I sat in my truck with my hands strangling the steering wheel, the leather groaning under my fingers, listening to the man who shared my daughter's bed broker a criminal raid against my family to save his own miserable life. 3 days, the loan shark finally agreed, cold and level. 72 hours to deliver warehouse access. And if you are lying to us, Vance, if this is another one of your pathetic stalls, we will not just break your legs. We will take your wife. We know where her little boutique is. We know her routine. We will take her, and we will make you watch what happens when you cross us. The air in my lungs turned to broken glass. My heart slammed against my ribs. I waited for Preston to defend his wife. I waited for him to tell that monster to leave Camille out of it, to show one single shred of human decency. Preston laughed, a cold, cynical little laugh. You can do whatever you want with her, he said, his voice utterly empty. She has no idea what is going on anyway. Give me the 3 days. I will get you the platinum. You take your cut, and I am taking my share and catching the first flight to Dubai. I lowered the phone and let the screen fade to black, the echo of that sentence hanging in the cab of my truck like smoke. He was willing to sacrifice his own wife. He would hand Camille to violent, merciless criminals to buy himself a plane ticket. A cold, dark fury wrapped itself around my heart and squeezed until my chest ached. I had believed he was a greedy, manipulative coward. Hearing him discard my daughter's life like a piece of worthless trash burned away whatever thin scrap of mercy I might have been holding in reserve. This was no longer about protecting assets or teaching an arrogant boy a lesson about respect. This was about removing a dangerous predator from the fabric of my family, permanently and completely. He sealed his own fate with those words. From that moment on, I felt no pity. Only a deep, unwavering resolve to watch my plan run to its devastating conclusion. Because here is what Preston Vance, brilliant venture capitalist, master manipulator, never understood. He had swallowed a fiction whole and sold it to killers as gospel. There was no scrap metal in Warehouse 12. No decommissioned aerospace components. No secret pallets of platinum waiting on the loading dock. The manifest he photographed in my study was a pure, unadulterated work of fiction, written by my own hand for an audience of one. But Warehouse 12 was very far from empty. 5 years ago, a private security logistics firm, one of the licensed, federally contracted armored transport companies that move physical currency for the regional banking system, came to me through the Industrial Zoning Board with a lucrative and strictly confidential proposition. My main scrapyards sit on prime, accessible acreage, but Warehouse 12 is isolated at the end of a dead-end service road, flanked by concrete barriers and a disused rail spur. To the public, an eyesore. To anyone who requires absolute privacy and hard security, a tactical goldmine. I lease them the entire structure and the surrounding 3 acres. Every document reviewed by my attorneys, every dollar declared, every permit filed. The lease is boring, legal, and airtight. The only thing secret about it is its existence, and that secrecy is a contractual security requirement, not mine. From the street, the facility looks like a forgotten relic of a dead industrial age, and I have kept it that way on purpose. The corrugated roof is streaked with rust. The massive sliding bay doors look warped and permanently jammed. The perimeter fence is deliberately choked with thorny weeds. It is a masterpiece of urban camouflage, engineered to make the eye slide right past it. But behind those rusted doors is a heavily fortified staging ground, reinforced walls, thermal monitoring on the roof, seismic sensors in the foundation. When armored trucks move massive volumes of physical cash across the region, they do not park in ordinary commercial lots to transfer loads and rotate armed personnel. They pull into secure hubs wired with silent alarms that ring straight through to regional law enforcement dispatch and the federal authorities. Hubs crisscrossed with invisible motion sensors that trip the instant the perimeter is breached. Hubs staffed around the clock by a tactical unit of highly trained, heavily armed guards who do not carry polite sidearms and do not ask polite questions. I sat in the cab of my truck, and a slow, grim smile spread across my face as I pictured the magnificent disaster Preston was busily arranging for himself. He was at that very moment convincing a violent syndicate to mobilize a professional robbery crew. He was promising them a soft target, an oblivious old man, and a few rusty padlocks. He was preparing to lead armed men straight into the jaws of a federally monitored stronghold. By cutting that chain, Preston Vance would not be committing a simple burglary against his father-in-law. He would be launching an armed assault on a secured currency transport facility. The moment he and his hired muscle crossed that threshold, the silent alarms would scream through every law enforcement channel in the region, and he would find himself facing men whose job description begins where negotiation ends. There would be no smooth talking, no clever escape, no high-priced attorney capable of digging him out from under the full weight of federal prosecution. The government does not bargain with people who raid its banking transport hubs. It buries them under mandatory minimums in maximum security. He wanted the ultimate score to fund his escape to Dubai. I was handing him a one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary. He had decided to let my daughter rot with her bankrupted flower shop. Now he would be the one rotting behind iron bars, alongside the very criminals he had tried to double-cross. The trap was flawless, inescapable, and primed to snap shut the second he made his move. I turned the key, listened to the steady rumble of my engine, and pulled away from the curb. The countdown had begun. I had given him exactly 72 hours to hang himself, and I intended to savor every last second of the drop. Those 3 days passed with the agonizing slowness of a ticking bomb. Preston operated with a manic, terrifying efficiency. He spent hours locked in their townhouse, making hushed calls, finalizing the logistics of his betrayal, while feeding Camille a steady diet of charming lies about late-night meetings and a venture capital breakthrough waiting just over the horizon. She absorbed every word because she loved him, and love is the one lock a con man never has to pick. That Friday night, Preston announced a mandatory after-hours dinner with an international investor. He kissed Camille's cheek and drove off into the dark to coordinate an armed robbery. I waited exactly 2 hours after his departure. At 1:45 I walked into my living room, where Camille sat curled on the sofa with a book and told her to put her coat on. We needed to take a drive. She looked up, brow furrowed, gesturing at the grandfather clock and protesting that she was dressed for bed. I did not raise my voice and I did not negotiate. I told her I had found something that belonged to her mother, something deeply important connected to Eleanor, and that I needed to show it to her tonight. The mention of her mother was the only key that could bypass her resistance. She sighed, set the book down, pulled a heavy wool coat over her shoulders, and followed me out to my truck. The drive was wrapped in a thick, oppressive silence. Camille stared out the window as the pristine lawns of Shaker Heights gave way to the cracked roads of the industrial flats. The bright streetlights thinned into flickering sodium lamps, washing a jaundiced glow over the decaying landscape. She shifted in her seat and asked where we were going, annoyance curdling into a quiet anxiety. I kept my eyes on the road and told her to be patient. I told her that some truths can only be understood when you look at them in the dark. I threaded the labyrinth of dead factories with practiced ease. This was my territory, a world of rust and sweat and hard labor that Preston believed he could stroll in and strip for parts. I turned down a narrow service road between walls of corrugated steel and crumbling brick, killed the headlights, and let the truck roll silently through the shadows into a secluded alley. I stopped, shifted into park, and let the engine idle, the only sound in the wasteland. Camille peered through the windshield at the massive, dilapidated structure looming across the street from our hidden vantage point. Warehouse 12, from the alley it looked like a tomb, grime-streaked walls, fences strangled in dead weeds. Bay doors rusted shut. Camille turned to me, her face pale in the dashboard glow, and demanded to know why I had dragged her to a condemned scrapyard in the middle of the night, and what any of it could possibly have to do with her mother. I did not answer right away. I reached into my briefcase on the center console and pulled out my silver tablet, the same device her husband had so eagerly photographed 3 days earlier. I unlocked it, bypassed my email, and opened the encrypted software tied to the security network of Warehouse 12. The screen flared to life, filling the dark cab with a stark bluish glow. I split the display into 4 panels. 2 showed the infrared exterior feeds, covering the front gates and the loading dock. 2 showed the interior, the pristine, brightly lit, hardened staging ground that Preston did not know existed. Then I turned to my daughter, looked into her confused, frightened eyes, and dismantled her world one careful sentence at a time. I told her the man she married was not a venture capitalist, that his entire firm was a rented post office box, that he had gambled away his inheritance in a catastrophic string of speculative bets. I watched the blood drain from her face as I explained, calmly and without a single softened edge, that her husband owed $2 million to a violent loan shark syndicate. I told her that for the past 8 months, Preston had been systematically siphoning money out of her floral boutique, pushing her business toward forced bankruptcy just to cover the minimum interest on his hidden debts. She opened her mouth to deny it, to defend the man she loved, and the words died in her throat. She could see the certainty in my eyes. She knows me. She knows I would never manufacture a lie of that magnitude. I held the glowing tablet out to her, my hand perfectly steady. I told her Preston had broken into my study. I told her about the fabricated manifest, 15 million in fictional platinum, supposedly stored in the exact building looming across the street. I told her he had sold that fiction to his criminal creditors and brokered a heist to save his own life and fund a one-way flight out of the country. And then I told her the last thing, that Warehouse 12 was not a scrapyard at all, that behind that rusted skin was a fortified currency transport hub, wired with silent federal alarms and motion sensors, guarded around the clock by a tactical team that does not miss. I pressed the tablet gently into her trembling hands. I told her to watch the screen. I told her the mandatory dinner meeting was a rendezvous with a robbery crew, and that within the next few minutes, she was going to watch her husband try to breach that building. She was going to watch the illusion shatter. She was going to see, with her own eyes, the true face of the man behind the mask. I placed my hand over hers, and together in the dark we waited. The silence inside the truck was suffocating. Camille sat frozen, wide eyes locked on the glowing screen, holding her breath, silently begging whatever God was listening to let me be a paranoid old man making a terrible mistake. I could feel the small tremors running through her hand under mine. Headlights appeared at the mouth of the service road, then went dark. A vehicle rolled slowly into frame on the infrared feed, followed by a second. Three figures emerged, rendered in the ghostly grayscale of night vision. Two of them moved like professionals, broad, deliberate rifles slung. The third walked with a false, arrogant swagger I would have recognized in any light, at any distance. Preston, fully convinced of his own manufactured brilliance, leading armed mercenaries across Graval, toward the main gate of a building he understood not at all. Beside me, Camille made a small wounded sound. There he was, the mandatory investor dinner. The final proof, walking on two legs. And then the audio feed delivered the blow that broke her heart for good. The sensitive exterior microphones picked up the men's voices as they approached the gate, and out of Preston's own mouth, casual and cold, came words about his wife. That she was clueless, that she had no idea what was going on, that the dumb broad could rot with her bankrupt flower shop. The silence in my truck afterward was absolute. Camille stared at the screen, her beautiful face drained of every drop of color, the perfect illusion she had guarded for 2 years, shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Then she folded forward and broke, her shoulders shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. I reached across the console and wrapped my arms around my devastated daughter. "I promised your mother," I whispered fiercely into her hair, "that I would never let a man destroy your life and get away with it." When she finally pulled back, the tears had stopped. Something cold and hollow had settled into her eyes, and beneath it, something harder. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and turned her gaze back to the screen. We watched the three men reach the main gate. The thick chain on the rusted iron fence looked formidable. It was theater. Preston raised the heavy industrial bolt cutters, locked the steel jaws around the center link, and leaned his whole body into the handles. The sharp metallic snap echoed down the alley, captured by the microphones and broadcast into the cab of my truck. The severed chain dropped into the dirt. The gate screamed open on ungreased hinges. The two gunmen swept the empty perimeter with their rifles raised, entirely unaware that thermal cameras were tracking every heartbeat in their chests. They crossed 50 yards of cracked, weed-choked concrete. Preston led them straight to the massive corrugated loading bay door, the exact spot where he believed his salvation was waiting on wooden pallets. He pulled out his phone, and I knew precisely what was on that screen. The photographs he had stolen from my study. The access codes I had written specifically for him. He stepped to the rusted keypad mounted on the brick and punched in the sequence with eager, trembling fingers. A deep, hydraulic clunk rolled out from the belly of the building. The steel door began to grind upward on its tracks. Preston took one confident step forward, a victorious smile spreading across his face, fully expecting a dark, quiet room stacked with platinum. His expensive leather shoes crossed the invisible plane of the motion sensors. The trap did not simply spring. It detonated. Before he could take a second step, banks of military-grade floodlights ignited across the entire yard simultaneously, turning pitch-black midnight into blinding artificial noon. The glare was so fierce that Camille and I shielded our eyes inside the truck 100 yards away. A split second later, a federal-grade emergency siren erupted from the roof, a bone-rattling, rhythmic shriek engineered to disorient and paralyze. On the screen, Preston froze mid-stride. The victorious smile evaporated, replaced by a mask of sheer, undiluted panic. His phone hit the concrete. He threw his arms up against the light. The two mercenaries reacted on instinct, rifles rising, training kicking in as they hunted for targets in the chaos. But their experience also let them read the situation instantly. And what they read turned their blood to ice. This was no poorly guarded scrapyard. They had walked into a fortified stronghold. Heavy tactical doors swung open on every side of the yard, and armored guards poured into the light, moving with terrifying speed and absolute precision, collapsing into an inescapable perimeter around the three intruders. Every weapon was raised, every muzzle was locked on target, a booming amplified voice cut clean through the siren. "Armed security. Federal authorities are en route. Drop your weapons immediately or you will be fired upon. Do it now." The mercenaries were violent men, but they were not suicidal. They knew they were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and out of options. Their rifles clattered to the concrete. They laced their fingers behind their heads and went down to their knees without a word. Preston did not kneel. Preston disintegrated. The polished venture capitalist simply ceased to exist, and what remained was a shaking, sobbing shell. He dropped the bolt cutters, and then his legs quit beneath him, and he collapsed into a shallow puddle of mud as red laser sights danced across the lapels of his designer suit. He threw his hands in the air. He began to wail, loud, hysterical, begging for his life, screaming into the lights that it was all a mistake, that he was just a businessman looking for his father-in-law. The guards ignored every word. 4 armored officers moved in fast, put him face down in the mud, wrenched his arms behind his back, and closed steel cuffs around his wrists. And in the merciless clarity of the floodlights, I watched a dark stain spread across the front of his tailored trousers. In the face of real, immediate consequence, Preston Vance had lost control of himself entirely, crying face down in the mud like a frightened child while his freedom was stripped away. I looked over at my daughter. Camille was staring at the screen, transfixed by the pathetic spectacle on the concrete, and there was no pity left anywhere in her face. No love, no grief. The illusion he had maintained for 2 years was gone, permanently, and she was finally seeing the miserable, cowardly reality of the man who had promised to cherish her. She reached over slowly and closed the cover of the tablet, shutting off the feed, and let out a long, heavy breath, releasing a burden she had been unknowingly carrying for 2 years. When she looked at me, her eyes were completely clear. The next morning, sunlight fell in long, pale gold bars across the granite of my kitchen. The house was profoundly quiet after the chaos of sirens and screaming mercenaries the night before. I stood by the coffee maker, listening to the comforting drip while Camille sat at the island, hands wrapped around a warm mug, pale and exhausted, but with the 2-year tension finally gone from her shoulders. We had not talked much since the industrial district. There was nothing left to argue. She had seen the truth with her own eyes, and truth like that does its own talking. Her phone shattered the silence, buzzing hard against the granite. An unknown out-of-state number. She stared at it, apprehension clouding her face, then answered and laid it flat on the counter, on speaker. A cold, automated voice filled the kitchen. "This is a collect call from the County Correctional Facility. An inmate has requested to speak with you. To accept the charges, press 1 now." Camille looked up at me, eyes wide and searching. I gave her a single, firm nod. She pressed 1. The automated voice clicked off, replaced by the echoing clamor of a crowded holding block. And then we heard Preston. "Camille, please tell me you are there." His voice was a high, pathetic, desperate whine, sobbing words tripping over each other. "You have to listen. There has been a massive misunderstanding. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was just driving past your father's old warehouse and armed men jumped out of nowhere. The police arrested me by mistake. They have me in a cell with violent criminals. Camille, it is terrifying in here. Call my lawyer right now. Drain the business accounts and post my bail today. They are talking about federal charges, but it is all a lie. You have to get me out of here." I stood there listening to that sniveling coward pour fresh lies through the speaker. Even now, behind steel bars and staring down decades, he was still working her, still reaching for his favorite tool. 2 nights earlier, he had offered her up to loan sharks like loose change, and now he was begging her to empty her gutted flower shop to buy back his freedom. The audacity of it was very nearly breathtaking. I watched Camille. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but her expression never softened. Her face hardened into pure, undisguised revulsion. She opened her mouth, ready to unleash a fury she had every right to unleash, and I gently laid my hand over hers and shook my head. This was not her burden anymore. The final word belonged to me. I picked up the phone and lifted it to my ear. I took 1 slow breath and let the cold settle all the way into my voice. "Hello, Preston." The sobbing stopped instantly. The silence that followed was so total I could almost hear his heartbeat through the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was a trembling whisper. "Nathaniel, where is Camille? Why do you have her phone? I want to speak to my wife." "Camille is sitting right beside me," I said calmly and took a sip of my coffee. "And she has nothing to say to you. She is finished listening to your lies." We had a very illuminating evening, Preston. We took a scenic drive down to the industrial flats. We parked in a dark little alley across from a certain dilapidated building, and we watched a highly entertaining show on my security feed. We watched you break into a secured currency transport facility, and we watched you cry face down in the mud when the tactical team came out to greet you. A sharp, strangled intake of breath came down the line. "You were there," he choked. "You set me up, you faked that manifest, you led me into a trap. I did not set you up, Preston, I corrected him, feeling a deep, quiet warmth spread through my chest. I simply built you a mirror and you sprinted at it. You wanted to steal my legacy. You were willing to hand my daughter to violent criminals to cover your own escape. You wanted my warehouse, son. Well, you got it, but you did not break into a clueless old man's scrapyard, and you did not find 15 million in platinum. You led armed men into a monitored federal transport facility. The men you brought were carrying illegal rifles. You triggered a full tactical response, and every second of it is on camera. Nathaniel, please, he begged, his voice shattering into high, hysterical sobs. You have to tell them the truth. You have to help me. I laughed once, low and cold, without a trace of humor in it. I am not going to help you, Preston. What I am going to do is finish my coffee, take my daughter to breakfast, and let the federal prosecutors do what they do best. Enjoy the next 25 years. You are a ghost to this family now. He was still screaming when I pressed the red button. Then I blocked the number, set the phone on the granite, and looked out the window, where the morning sun was shining like it had someplace to be. 1 month later, the clouds that had smothered our family finally broke apart for good. Preston sat in an isolation cell in a federal detention center, awaiting a very public trial, indicted along the syndicate loan sharks he had so brazenly tried to double-cross. A federal judge took one look at the mountain of evidence, the surveillance footage, the recorded calls his own co-conspirators surrendered in their plea deals, the armed men, the stolen access codes, and denied bail on the spot, declaring him an extreme flight risk. He was going nowhere. The tailored suits were finished. The man who believed he was untouchable was on his way to becoming exactly what he had always feared most. Forgotten. On a remarkably beautiful Thursday morning, I drove my daughter into the heart of the city. Camille sat in the passenger seat of my truck, her color fully restored, her posture carrying a quiet, undeniable strength, the dark circles gone from under her eyes. The divorce was already moving with remarkable swiftness, surgically cutting Preston out of her life. We parked outside a towering glass building and rode a silent elevator to the top floor, where Gregory Solomon, my most trusted corporate attorney and a fierce loyalist to this family for 30 years, was waiting in his corner office. Camille settled into a leather armchair and shot me a curious, questioning look. I crossed the carpet, sat down beside her, and drew a small velvet pouch from my coat pocket. I opened it and set a single heavy brass key on the polished mahogany desk between us. She stared at it, completely bewildered, and asked what it opened. I smiled and covered her hand with mine. I told her that a man who spends his whole life building an empire out of jagged scrap learns to hide his most precious treasures where no one thinks to look. Preston had believed my wealth was locked in a rusted warehouse or sitting exposed in personal bank accounts, because Preston was a superficial creature who never once understood the depth of a father's protective instinct. I nodded to Gregory, who handed Camille a thick, leather-bound portfolio. "Open it," I told her. Her trembling fingers turned the heavy pages. She stared at the legal documents, struggling to absorb the figures printed in bold black ink. I explained that years ago, shortly before her mother passed, Eleanor and I had quietly established an ironclad trust exclusively in Camille's name. The real wealth, the full culmination of my life's hardest work, had been legally insulated the entire time, wrapped in layers of corporate law, entirely beyond the reach of any greedy, manipulative spouse. The brass key opened a private vault, holding the certified asset deeds and instruments that belonged solely to her. Preston had spent 2 years hunting a fortune he never had the legal ability to touch. Not for one single day of his marriage. Tears of overwhelming gratitude spilled down Camille's cheeks. She stood abruptly and wrapped her arms around my neck, burying her face in my shoulder, and I held my daughter and felt the bond between us settle back into place, stronger than before. She thanked me over and over, and I told her the plain truth. Protecting her has been the single greatest privilege of my life. Later that week, Camille officially reopened her floral boutique. With the suffocating anchor of Preston's secret financial drain cut away, the business began to breathe again almost immediately. She hired 2 assistants to manage the overflowing orders, and her bright, easy laughter rang through that fragrant, colorful shop the way it used to before he ever walked into her life. She was reclaiming her independence, one bouquet at a time. But I want to be honest with you about something, because this is the part of the story I did not understand until it was over. In the weeks after the arrest, Camille and I sat on my porch many evenings, and some of those conversations were harder than anything that happened at Warehouse 12. She asked me questions I could not answer with a clever trap. Why did I not see it, Dad? How could I share a bed with a man for 2 years and never see him? And I had to tell her the truth. She did not fail, she loved honestly, and a predator turned that honesty into a tool. There is no shame in being lied to by a professional liar. The shame belongs entirely to the liar. And I had to face a hard question of my own. For 3 months I had watched and planned and let the trap tighten, and there were nights I asked myself whether I should have simply sat her down on day one and shown her my suspicions. Maybe. But I had seen what his lies had already built inside her. If I had accused him without proof, she would have defended him, and I might have lost my daughter to protect her. Some truths cannot be handed to the people we love, they have to be witnessed. My job was not to tell her who Preston was. My job was to make sure that when the truth arrived, she was standing somewhere safe, with someone who loved her when it hit. We also changed something in our family that should have been changed years earlier. We started talking about money. Openly. Camille sat down with Gregory and learned every line of her trust, every account, every protection her mother and I had built. Because here is a lesson I learned the hard way, and I hope you will take it from me for free. Secrecy protects wealth from thieves, but silence leaves the people you love unarmed. If I had taught my daughter to read a balance sheet with the same devotion I taught her to arrange lilies, Preston Vance would never have gotten past the front door. Love your children enough to make them hard targets. And to every parent listening who has watched a charming stranger attach themselves to your child, hear me clearly. Do not attack, do not accuse, do not hand the manipulator the gift of becoming the victim in the story. Stay close, stay patient, keep your eyes open and your mouth shut, and be the steady ground your child can land on when the illusion finally cracks. Because it always cracks. Greed is a blinding poison. It convinces arrogant men that they are smarter than everyone in the room, and in that blindness they always build their own cage. Preston did not fall into my trap. He built it himself out of his own hunger, one lie at a time. All I did was hold up a mirror and stand out of the way. That Sunday evening, I sat alone on the wooden porch of my quiet house. The sun hung low over the horizon, laying a warm golden glow across the lawn. I held a crystal glass of good bourbon, the peaceful kind of quiet all around me, the kind that had been missing from our lives for 2 long years. I took a slow sip, letting the warmth spread through my chest, and looked up at the wide-painted sky. And I felt her there, the way I sometimes do. I kept my promise, Eleanor, I said to the evening wind. Nobody takes what is ours. True wealth was never sitting in that warehouse, and it was never printed in that trust portfolio either. It is forged out of decades of honest sweat, fierce loyalty, and the unwavering instinct of a father defending his own. Never underestimate a quiet man who spent his whole life building an empire from scrap. He knows better than anyone how to recognize junk dressed up as treasure, and he knows exactly how to dispose of the trash that threatens his family. If this story proved to you that karma always comes to collect, smash that like button right now. Have you ever had to deal with a toxic partner or a greedy person trying to worm their way into your family? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one. And please subscribe to the channel so you never miss my daily life stories. Because trust me, an old man from Cleveland has plenty more where this one came from. This story was written and narrated from personal perspective for storytelling and entertainment purposes. Names, characters, businesses, places, and events portrayed in this story are used in a fictionalized manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The views and life lessons shared here reflect the personal opinions and lived experience of the author. This channel features original, human-crafted storytelling, and every story is reviewed and edited by our writing team before publication. Thank you for listening, and for being part of this community.